Okay. It seems like people are mostly in at this point to the Zoom session. But the beginning stuff is always logistics, so they won't miss too much if we go ahead and get started. So one more time, in the chat is a link to the community notes document. I think we have 2 official note takers, so I appreciate that. Somehow I got a double recruitment, which I appreciate because I'm not a great note taker while I am organizing and talking. So this is the terms of use, licensing, and installation policies breakout session. It's been great to see everybody introduce themselves in the chat as we are getting started. We have a quick, a little bit of a schedule put together. We only have 2 talks, so it's going to be kind of a discussion heavy session, which might mean that we can wrap up maybe 10 or 15 minutes early, depending on what we get into. But I'm going to kick us off with a kind of intro to data licensing, just to provide a little bit of context for the rest of the session. And then we're going to have some talks by Julian from IQSS on updates on multiple license support. So there's been a lot of work on adding different licenses, support for different licenses in Dataverse. So Julian will talk about that. And then Wim from Don's is going to give us a talk on automation and machine readability of licenses, which I am very curious to learn more about. We'll have kind of like a dedicated time for specific Q&A for the speakers. And then I've got a couple of things prepared to organize a more informal discussion about terms of use, installation policies, data licenses, all sorts of things like that for the last maybe 45 minutes or so. Without further ado, we can, so I have this Mentimeter, which I always forget about, but it's going to help us organize the discussion at the end a little bit. So if you want to head to menti.com and then put in the code 54789498. I believe it is in the, community notes right here. So take a look at that poll. It's going to kind of, give us a little bit of focus areas for the discussion at the end. I'm going to leave this up throughout all the talks. And so as things kind of strike you, think a little bit about what you might want to focus our discussion on at the end. All right, so this is a quick introduction to data licensing. I'm gonna start, I've got some slides that are linked at this bit.ly down here. It's bit.ly/data_licenses, and licenses is plural. If you do data_license, it will take you to Stanford Library's information on data licenses, which is helpful, but not exactly the same content. So it's a plural licenses if you want to follow along. Okay, so the main question I'm going to really be addressing in this talk is not necessarily should I license my data, but it is how should I license my data. First of all, a data license is a legal instrument that specifies a standard set of terms and conditions regarding sharing and reuse of your research data. In order to successfully or appropriately apply a data license, it's helpful to start by making sure that you actually do have the rights to share your data, and then you also need to know whether or not your data is actually copyrightable, or at least have a good guess of whether it might be. It turns out that in the US and in many places, a lot of data are not actually copyrightable because facts are not copyrightable. And that makes sense because we don't really want copyright to be weaponized to keep people from sharing facts and sharing basic information. This quote is from a 1991 US Supreme Court case that determined that facts are not the result of original creative works and therefore may not be copyrightable. But that's not like a super accurate representation of research data in general. In order to determine whether your data might fall under copyright, it can be helpful to ask a few questions of it. Data sets don't necessarily always look like phone books, which is what that case was referring to. It was whether or not you can share information that was found in a phone book under copyright. So is your data like a phone book? That's a helpful question to start with. A particular arrangement of facts might be eligible for copyright protection if that arrangement demonstrates sufficient creativity, but not if the arrangement is something uncreative, like chronological order or alphabetical order. And even with creative arrangement of data, it's still perfectly legal for someone else to pull out the underlying facts, rearrange them, and then use them in something new. Your location matters. So different countries have different laws. In the EU, for example, certain research data also might be subject to a special database right that we don't really have distinguished in US copyright law. Universities sometimes have IP policies that might affect the copyright status of your data. Like it may specify that patent ownership, for example, lies with the university and copyright ownership rests with employees. Or it might just say something like data is the property of the university without addressing what exactly is owned. So it's helpful to check those out. Government agencies are also increasingly requiring that research data they fund be publicly shared. So some might have specific agreements or specific licenses under which data might be released. So it's useful to think about that. Consider your grant terms and your agreements. Obviously, if you have purchased or licensed data from a vendor or a third party, you must abide by the license that you agreed to, or something like the terms of service from an API. If that's how you access your data, it would also be relevant in this situation. And then finally, some data might actually look a whole lot like copyrightable content. Photographs, music scores, full text of monographs, even field notes that are highly narrative are more likely to be copyrighted than something like a table of numbers. The less your data is trying to simply report objective facts about the universe, and the more it embodies creative expression, the more likely it is that you or the original copywriter hold copyright in it. All right, so once you have determined copyright status, or at least taken kind of a guess of what rights and responsibilities you have to that data, there are lots of different licenses that are more or less appropriate for different types of work. So Creative Commons licenses are good options that are familiar to a lot of researchers and a lot of users. CC BY is an especially popular license because of its requirement for attribution. We like to get credit for the stuff that we produce. The Open Data Commons also has developed several licenses specifically for sharing data. There are also, over in this column, research objects that are not data, like software or research protocols, or something else might be more suited for something like an open source software license, like the MIT license, GPL 3.0 or Apache 2.0 licenses. Those are good options for software. And then in the middle here, there's also public domain waivers and markers, which is what the default in Dataverse has always been, that CC0 license that many of us are probably pretty familiar with. I'd like to point out that there is kind of a difference between something like this public domain mark and CC0 or the Open Data Commons public domain dedication. The public domain mark identifies that you are publishing something that has no known copyright or is already in the public domain. You didn't make it, you aren't putting it in the public domain, it just already is, and you are republishing it in your unique context. CC0 and the PDL are waivers that say, if I hold copyright in this, I waive it. And if we're dealing with a country where we can't waive copyright, then here is a very broad public license with no attribution requirement. And then also, just as a backup, I promise I'm not going to sue you if you use it. So that's the difference between public domain and a waiver. Just to kind of further emphasize, that I would say kind of overwhelmingly best practice recommends using an open, permissive license and where possible, releasing research data into the public domain. And the thought behind that is the easier you make it for people to reuse your data, And the clearer you make it that you aren't planning on suing people who do, the more likely it is that your data will be reused. Obviously one of the primary purposes of archiving data in the Dataverse repository is to enable its reuse by other people. Having clear and open terms of reuse helps realize that goal. CC0 was crafted specifically to reduce any legal and technical impediments to the reuse of data. As I mentioned earlier, in most cases, CC0 does not actually affect the legal status of the data, since facts, in and of themselves are not necessarily eligible for copyright in a lot of countries. But where they are, CC0 waives copyright and related rights to the extent permitted by law. Importantly, CC0 does not exempt those who reuse the data from following community norms for scholarly communication. It does not exempt researchers from reusing the data in a way that is mindful of its limitations, nor does it exempt researchers from the obligation of citing the original data authors. However, like other scientific norms, these expectations are best articulated and enforced by the community itself through processes such as peer review. By removing unenforceable legal barriers, CC0 facilitates the discovery, reuse, and citation of research data. And that's why it's a very good license that we like a whole lot, a very good waiver that we like a whole lot. There's also, Dataverse software also supports the application of custom terms of use fields. So these can come in especially useful either alongside or to replace a standard license. And some reasons for using this might be, in cases of sensitive data or restricted files, terms of use can help indicate access terms and data use agreements that might be necessary. Institutions may have a legal team that develop custom access and use restrictions according to their needs or grant agreements. So, in Harvard Dataverse, we have a couple of, big organizations that have a legal team behind them that have developed their own licenses, and those can be added in the terms of use section. Terms of use can also be helpful to move attribution from the legal realm into the social or ethical realm by pairing a very permissive license with a strong moral entreaty, such as requesting users to continue to use open licenses, share their results freely, or cite generously. Okay, so to sum up, when you are thinking about what license to apply to your data set, consider whether you may or may not actually hold copyright. What have you already agreed to, and how complex your data or data sets are. Keep in mind why you are sharing your data, for reuse and the advancement of research in many cases, but not all, I guess. So it's important to think about what the best, most permissive license is for your data set, given the responsibilities or restrictions that you have just identified. All right, finally, just to emphasize one more time, if attribution is the only reason that you want to add a BY to your CC license, reconsider whether a license is really the best way to achieve proper credit for your work. These are some references that might be very helpful going forward. A lot of the information in these slides and things that I've just said came from a great talk by Katie Fortney that was based on some of these blog posts that I've identified. Choosealicense.com is really helpful. It does kind of a quick overview of some of the major software licenses. So that's a great place too. These Dryad blog posts really focus on the importance of using CC0. So that's pretty good too. All right. Oh, Tanya is kicking me off. She's our timekeeper. Thanks, Tanya. All right, so next up we have Julian Gauthier, who is the product research specialist at IQSS, and he's going to give us an update on multiple license support in Dataverse.
Thanks, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen now. Oops, wrong button. Can anyone see that that slide?
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Great. Like the Zoom controls are in the way of my slide. Zoom controls. Oops. So Katie already introduced me. This talk will be giving an overview of the work that DONS is implementing for multiple license support in Dataverse. So I'll be talking about why this is needed, what the solutions are, like a brief a summary of the solutions, some of the research that we did, and the tricky questions that we surfaced from that research and try to answer and try to provide solutions for, and a couple of links at the end that, of course, they're, when these slides become available, you'll be able to click on them and go to other resources. Although these resources have been distributed widely in the community already. So because the Dataverse Project mission has centered around the free and open use of research data, the community initially focused on facilitating and encouraging the waiving of any rights that depositors might have to their data, like Katie was talking about. So CC0 was very much encouraged. And you can see that in the deposit workflow, the design decisions that were made. But over the years, the project's growing community has expressed a need to make it easier for depositors to apply different terms of use and access to their data, apply those terms of use and access in more human and machine readable ways so that people, search engines, and other discovery layers can more easily determine how the research data can be accessed and used. Specifically through multiple channels over the years, the community has expressed need to make it easier for machines to index and expose search results, the licenses that depositors choose, let repository administrators control which licenses their depositors can choose, and make it easier for depositors to recognize throughout the deposit workflow which terms are set for the data that they're depositing. So DONS contracted with GDCC to implement functionality in the Dataverse software that would meet these needs. The GDCC agreed to help with the design work, and DONS, specifically Jan, Linda, and Paul, agreed to do the development work. Jim Myers led the work and created the initial proposal, and members of the IQSS team consulted. The work officially began in late January 2021, and the group agreed to have a solution in place at the time by the end of July. So it was decided that we should add a drop-down list with predefined licenses that depositors can choose from. That's like the quick summary of the solution, and that the design would grow from there. Any changes that needed to be made would grow from there. This is a solution that multiple community members have suggested over the years, one that other repository software had already implemented. So researchers who've used other repositories and curators and librarians who would already be familiar with this solution. And it's one we believe would require minimal changes to the deposit workflow so that it could be done within the time frame that had been set. To keep the solution as simple as possible and to reduce the amount of work on the user interface, the group decided that any new license-related administrator settings would be controlled at the installation level and not at the Dataverse collection level, and that those settings, like choosing what appeared in the drop-down list, could be done using the Dataverse API, which installation administrators would already be familiar with. So we fleshed out details of the workflows for depositors, administrators, and users searching for data. We analyzed the metadata of 47 known Dataverse repositories, and we reviewed a few iterations of the design with community members. Jim broadly distributed a summary of the proposal that included answers to frequently asked questions, and we gathered and reviewed the feedback and addressed as much of it as we could. All of this helped us surface and answer some questions about the design. Mostly, some of the more interesting questions had to do with the relationships between the DDI codebook inspired terms fields in the terms tab on the dataset page and well-known data licenses, default licenses, and preventing publishing without licenses or without explicit terms. So I just want to go through each of those topics quickly. The relationships, so the first one, if a depositor selects a license, the current design that's being worked on right now by Don prohibits depositors from using some of the DDI codebook inspired fields, which are the fields in the terms of use panel, the first half of the page when you're on the terms tab. This was done to prevent conflicting statements about terms of use and access so that depositors can't add information into those fields that might conflict with what's in the selected license. It could potentially also prevent redundant statements, so preventing depositors from feeling like they need to enter information that's already in the selected license. The metadata analysis helps us find cases of both of these things happening in Dataverse repositories. But some of the questions that we still have are there cases where depositors need to select a common license and add additional information in the DDI codebook inspired fields? There have been, the proposal that Jim, we thought a lot about this, and the proposal that Jim distributed addresses this. And then the second one, another question regarding the relationship between licenses and these DDI codebook terms is it valuable to add certain information from common licenses into the DDI codebook expired fields? The ones that will now be hidden, particularly. The second point about default licenses, at the start of the project, Don's preferred that when a depositor created a data set, a default license would not be applied as CC0 is now. They wanted to be sure that depositors were aware of the license being applied before the data set was published. In the process of iterating through the work, the changes that would have to be made to the workflow, we made other changes so that depositors could more easily find out before publishing the data set if a predefined or custom license was applied to the data set, and if a predefined license was applied, it showed the name of the license. And seeing that Don's reconsidered their preference to not allow defaults, but ultimately it was decided to make this configurable. Like you might have read already in Jim's summary, installations can choose a default or choose no default. And then last, regarding preventing publishing without licenses or explicit terms, we want to help researchers be clear about how their data can be accessed and used. And we want to make sure that people who find the data are as certain as possible how it can be used and how it can be accessed. And there are lots of published data sets with no information about use and access. We talked about a few ways that the software can encourage or force depositors to add this information instead of making it more obvious during the deposit workflow that no predefined license or custom terms have been entered. The thinking is that making this lack of information obvious will encourage depositors to add this information before the data sets are published. And because installations can create and add custom licenses, or installation administrators can create and add custom licenses, they could provide custom licenses that take things like local laws and rules into account. For example, the things that Katie mentioned, like a country's copyright laws or institutional copyright rules. And then these are the two links that I wanted to make sure that everyone could access if you look at these slides when they're shared. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. That was so great. That was a great update on some of that really important work that's going on. All right, so we've got our next speaker, Wim Hugo, who is the Chief Technology Officer at DONS, to talk about machine readability of licenses and opportunities for automation. So take it away.
Thanks, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
All right, so I'm going to present what I see as a sort of a broader perspective on licensing and what the implications of automation might be. I'm of course new to the Dataverse community, so some of this ground may have been covered before in discussions. And of course, the ideas that I'm presenting here to some extent align with the work that Dance has done, but I'm also proposing potentially some refinements to that in the future. So I'm quickly going to look at the elements of a typical license, how a machine wants to view such a license, and then what automation of license activity implies for repository software and its functionality. Now, a license describes the rights of the owner. Katie has given us good background on that, and which of these rights are afforded to the end user by way of a license. And there's really two extremes. The one says that all of the rights of the owner are reserved, or that most of them or all of them are waived by way of typically public domain licenses. Now, an important point to make is that elements such as embargo does not change the license. It's essentially a time period or a start and end date associated with the workflow or publication state of that object. But the license during the embargo period, certainly from a conceptual point of view, remains exactly the same. And then the other point to make is that on the right-hand side, you can see that in broad terms, there are 4 elements of licenses. The one deals with permissions, the other with conditions, with limitations, and then with restrictions. And all of these are subtly different. And Creative Commons, as a free culture set of licenses, avoid restrictions because their argument is that a free culture license shouldn't have any restrictions. And in many cases, these restrictions are included in the terms of use independently of licenses. But I'm arguing that these should ideally be part of the license because whatever they imply should live with a digital object independent of the software platform. And one shouldn't have to go to a specific software platform to discover the terms of use or the restrictions that apply to a specific digital object. The next few slides contain work that was largely done as part of an EU-funded project called SecreFog. It's not important to understand what it means, but in that project, we made quite a comprehensive survey of data policies and attendant licenses and started looking at some form of description of all the elements that were common to these different licenses. So we have these permission type elements that describes whether things can be used commercially, how it may be distributed, whether it could be modified, and what implications are for patents and for private use. We also then have the situation where for sensitive or private data, personal information, we want to add to this in terms of the terms of distribution. And typically this includes things like that the data may only be distributed or used under supervision in a specific location sometimes, or that the use of the data for a specific purpose must first be approved by the owner of the rights. And I've highlighted that in red because it's a huge issue from a preservation point of view. Those rights owners may not be around in 10 years from now to grant such permissions. So we need protocols to handle that situation, preferably automatically in future. When I'm talking about a no harm license, it's a sort of a general term for these more restrictive licenses that I believe we need, where we specify in essence that no actions taken by the researcher that is reusing the data should harm an individual, an institution, a community, or a natural system. There are also conditions applicable to licenses. One of the most common ones is that we must have proper citation and attribution of our data sources, and things like share alike, and the fact that we must record the changes we make to software code or to data are typical additional conditions. And to this, for a no harm purpose, we might also add the condition of anonymity that must be preserved. So if a data set already is anonymized, we shouldn't be able to do anything that reduces that anonymity and helps people to obtain more personal information than was present in the original data set. So that would be an additional example. There's also licenses, but I don't think they are so important. And then there's 3 additional restrictions that we cannot allocate to the free culture structure of elements. The one is that we, in some cases, need to verify identity and record the fact that people are working with the data. They have to supply some kind of motivation for why they want access to the data in some cases. And we, in most cases, even for Creative Commons licenses, the implication of those licenses are that we should make sure as a curator that the end user is familiar with the terms of the license before they start using that digital object. So a common one would be where we have a condition that the data cannot be used in a commercial for commercial purposes. And we've got no way really of verifying whether those license conditions are met if from a repository point of view, we don't make sure that the end user accedes to the license conditions. Now, the implications for repository functionality, the first one I think is to some extent already being discussed and being done in many instances, where our software needs to confirm the right to allocate a license in the first place at the time of accession or deposit. But as I said, we also need to record that the license conditions were acknowledged by the end user. All of those things are reasonably easy to do. We need to automate the workflow associated with seeking permission from rights owners when this is required. And as I pointed out, if data has been in a repository for a long time, then we need now already to understand what this means for the contracts that we enter into with depositors. More importantly, and not often discussed, we need some form of decision heuristic for defining an appropriate license from input licenses. So if a work is being remixed from different input licenses, we need a way to unambiguously determine what kind of license should apply to the output work. And this is a prerequisite for widespread automation of the research value chain in future. And then I think there is a very real need for a machine readable, actionable, no harm license or something like it. I discussed this with Creative Commons maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they were not particularly interested because of their objections to restrictions. But maybe the time is right to reopen that discussion and see whether one can make any progress with it. Okay, so what we have is an emerging vocabulary for description of the limitations, restrictions, permissions, and conditions contained in any license. If you click on the link in this presentation, you will go to BioPortal and find that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of licenses that we can choose from. And I think that it is impossible to teach software to automate thousands of licenses in these research workflow chains. So we should start working towards defining a common vocabulary, or maybe a few, and mapping these licenses to that common vocabulary so that our software only has to act on the common vocabulary's implications and not have to understand all these different licenses that people want to apply. And that's my story. Thanks.
That's tremendous, Wim. I think you brought up a lot of really important things to consider. that goes way beyond kind of basic licensing conversations that we normally have. So yeah, at this point, there's been some great discussion happening in the chat. I think some of it might be kind of more appropriate for our larger discussion a little bit later. But I did want to bring up kind of one part of Sherry's question about Dataverse specific question about license at the data set level versus a license per file. You know, thinking that different files in a data set might need different licenses. I was wondering, I mean, I think we know what the answer is based on Julian's presentation, but I wanted to kind of quickly give Julian an opportunity to describe whether or not this, you know, whether or not this came up and in what context, and how it was determined to be in or out of scope for the multiple license support, because it does seem kind of like the next question when you license something in Dataverse, you know, at the data set level. Was there consideration for licensing at the you know, Dataverse collection level or at the file level? Or if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, that would be that'd be great.
Yeah, this did come up in conversation, both internally and when we spoke with the community at large, like in the Google Group threads, and in one-on-one conversations with certain community members. And the current work is focused on the data set level, because we knew that the licensing at the file level would require more development work than DONs would need immediately for their you know, for their deadline. I think that Jim had written, I think in the document that where he summarized the work, that right now what a lot of curators do, what a lot of repositories do, is they'll write in the terms of use which licenses apply to which files in their data set. So at the data set level, the terms of use field, they'd write this license applies to this file or this group of files, and this license applies to this group of files. And we know that that's not terribly a machine readable solution. But yeah, I mean, we definitely acknowledge that that's something that the community definitely needs. And the same thing at the Dataverse level. I don't think anyone, I haven't seen any cases of anyone applying licenses to a Dataverse collection. There might be some where they write in the description field, perhaps, but that isn't, you know, that wouldn't be expected either, so it wouldn't be machine readable.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think yeah, we can follow up on the conversation about, you know, complex data sets with different licenses for different files or different types of things. I did want to invite Philip to maybe ask a little bit more about kind of the difference between CC0 and CC BY, just about kind of, I've been trying to follow the conversation, but it's hard to listen and read and, you know, think about this Zoom room at the same time. So Philip, if you want to kind of summarize what you've been talking about with regard to attribution and license stacking and what kind of potential things are worth thinking about in that context.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, were you muted? Sorry. We can hear you.
Yeah, it's just you know, I think many, or at least some Dataverse-based repository, they use CC0 as a default license. We do also, and sometimes you get the question about, you know, what about attribution? But you know, in the license tab at the dataset level, you see also this note on community norms and that we expect proper attribution. So my question is kind of, so I guess for a one-to-one use, if you just reuse one dataset or a few datasets, it doesn't really make any difference, I think, in practice, that if you use CC0 or CC BY, because we have these community norms. And I mean, as a researcher, you should not use sources without attributing your sources. But then there's this issue about attribution stacking. If you reuse a lot of data and derive them into a new data set. So if I understand this attribution stacking issue correctly, it's about it. So if you reuse CC0 data, it makes it easier to give this kind of moral attribution by just listing your sources. But if you have different licenses, it would request you to also mention all the licenses that the different data sets had been published under. So yeah, but then also my question is also so we expect researchers to comply with community standards, but what about data CC0 data being reused without outside research? So can we have the same expectations to other stakeholders, like commercial stakeholders and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a big question with a lot of pieces to it. I think Stian had a really good comment about kind of the technical implications that using CC0 versus CCBY might have, especially with regard to metadata and machine readability. And I would like to invite him to comment on that.
Yeah.
But before you do, I wanted to say just one quick thing about, I just wanted to include kind of the like legal piece of it. So, you know, CC0, yeah, it doesn't absolve you, of course, from, you know, citing things. It does remove the potential kind of like litigious aspect of, you know, some scenarios where, you know, a user can't, a data owner, you know, who has published a data set under CC0 then waives all rights to, you know, sue somebody for not providing correct attribution according to community norms and standards. So that's one component of it. And yeah, Stan, I'll let you, we've had a lot of good comments, so please take it away.
Okay, yeah, sorry for jumping late in, but it's just my understanding of this is why there's a big drive for CC0, particularly for metadata, basically everything you fill in a Dataverse compared to the files you've uploaded, is because then it can be captured in a knowledge graph or whatever. People can collecting, basically that's what Dataverse itself is doing when you have the different Dataverse universes. So to be able to do that without having to attribute every little one that you have included. You have 1 million data sets collected. Now you have 1 million citations to propagate, which basically you could be, yeah, just keep the data set as it is. You haven't removed any auto information then, which is strictly speaking what the CC BY license required to do. But that's kind of not the morally right way to do it either. With CC0, you're free to do whatever you want, really. But of course, as Philip pointed out, you have moral aspects, particularly as academics, to still do the attribution and citation when you use it. But maybe in some cases you don't need to do it, because if you have collected 10,000 samples of something, like I did, I was downloading all of Zenodo, for instance, right? If I was to include those as references in my paper, it just wouldn't work, right? And luckily the metadata was CC0, so I could republish that and just say, actually, I just get this from Zenodo metadata.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, it seems like in the chat, everybody is definitely on board with CC0 metadata. And Jim clarified that in Dataverse, metadata is always CC0. the license applies to the data and the files. It looks like Wim wants to jump in, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I think we also need to consider almost like best practices for which conditions apply when you are packaging digital objects together with a single PID and metadata record, and when they should not be packaged together. So software that can apply to that data set, but also to other data sets, to my mind, needs a different PID and its own metadata, because it is often, for a start, not developed by the same set of authors or contributors. It needs to be independently citable, and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of the architecture of research data infrastructure depends on typing of digital objects. And if we have composites of all kinds of different types, it makes it much more difficult for machines to act on them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good transition into kind of what seems to be the not blowout, but narrowly popular topic to focus on for the rest of the discussion. So thinking about how to license different types of research objects in combination with how to license complex data sets that have different types of research objects in them. You know, if you have software that you have for, you know, other curatorial or organizational purposes wanted to include as part of the same data set with some data or other components, what is an effective way to license that and to license different files. So I wanted to pull up this kind of Mentimeter response just so you guys can see how it kind of shook out a little bit. Pretty even at the top, but yeah, nobody else had any other amazing ideas for discussion features. So I'm glad I covered at least the ideas properly. I did want to, before we dive in, I wanted to kind of take get a sense of how people feel about breakout rooms in this size of a group. So it's the same Mentimeter if you just want to take a second to pop back in there and discuss whether or not breakout rooms are useful. I think they are a very divisive topic. So I thought we would just, you know, it looks like, I guess I can narrate the what looks like is happening right now. So far, it seems like maybe not going for a breakout room. I'll give it maybe 30 more seconds. Before I unshare my screen and keep us all in the same room. If we do switch and not go with breakout rooms, I am going to stop. I agree with him. I'm giving it a few more. We got to get people to answer though. I'm also afraid of breakouts, Philip. Yeah, I'm gonna see if we can kind of collectively moderate ourselves and use the hand raising feature. And if you feel like you have a break in the conversation and want to jump into something directly, feel free to unmute yourself. And if it gets completely unwieldy, then I will start muting people aggressively. So if you can behave, which I'm sure we all can, then all right, 23 to 5. I would say vote now or forever hold your peace. I think we will go ahead and stay in the single room. But I would like to maybe redirect it to this concept of complex research objects. I think that's a really interesting topic to start with. So let's dive in. Who wants to take us away? Sherry's had a few good comments recently, so I can call you out, Sherry, if you feel comfortable.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sure. No. Which comments are you referring to? I made quite a few in the chat.
It's true.
So-
I cannot keep up with the chat, I will admit.
Okay,
So I was
Well-
referring to the ones about different licenses at the file. I think it wasn't the first comment that you made, but a little bit later on is how yeah, the DDI metadata schema has a section for metadata licenses. Is this something captured licenses about metadata? I think that's the one I was referring to. Because
Yeah,
I
and
think,
actually,
yeah.
and someone did actually mention that that in the OAI PMH export that actually I haven't tried it, but somebody did actually, and they said that Jim said that in the export that the documentation has that. So I was just, yeah, I mean, we're talking about licenses, and I know Wilm was also referring to, every single digital object having some sort of license and chaining them together. And I'm not sure how one would actually do that. I was thinking about this yesterday when we talked about the software as well. If you're going to have software as its own file, altogether in a data set, then every object needs its own PID or own, DOI. So there's lots of things that on an individual level to actually aggregate things. If they don't have it at the individual level, it's sort of hard to aggregate them together. And some of these crates that I've been trying to understand, it all seems so magical at this point. Oh, and I just want to turn on my video since you did call on me, because the famous Tim, who always has to be a Dataverse. Anyway, there's Tim. So say hi.
Hi, Tim. Yes, you are very famous. Yeah, I think that's a good point about DOIs especially. So if you're licensing something and you have DOIs for the data set and DOIs for individual files for installations that have the file level DOIs turned on, how could you improve the connection for different licenses for different files, leveraging, PIDs like that? That's interesting. All right, Philip had asked for a Menti on what default license different repos attending are using. So I'm gonna take a second to pull that together. But yeah, in the meantime, does anybody, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about perhaps when you do have a data set that you would want to have different licenses for different components. How would you do that in Dataverse right now? How does the software allow you to do that?
So maybe I can try and answer that, at least in terms of the focusing on after the multiple license stuff is merged in from Don's. The idea there, again, I think there wasn't any reason we didn't want file level licenses other than thinking through that means a lot of work to add it into the file table and menus to be able to select those licenses. And then when you publish, how do we tell you you're publishing with these licenses on these files and stuff? And it just looked like enough work to delay. The thing we ended up with is essentially one of the niceties of the multiple license work at the data set level is the idea that, like in the ORE export, we have a field that says this is the license and it's the URI of the license. It's the URI of CC0 or CC BY. The workaround we have for if you wanted to say, my data files have this license and my software files have that license, is essentially to create a custom license and essentially write that text. And the problem with that is that, you know, there's no software out there that's going to go look at your text and realize you said data files have, even if the URL for CC0 is on the data files, it doesn't know that text. And so we essentially don't have machine readability if you make multiple licenses with that workaround. And I think that's what we'll get if and when we get to the file level licenses. But in the meantime, you can use that, and essentially that's what people have been doing even when the CC0 license was in as it is today. They just use those terms fields from DDI and write in whatever they felt that you know would conflict with that, but they could put in whatever licenses they felt they needed.
Sure. Okay. It looks like we have some hand raised. Wim, I think you were first with your hand raised, so please respond.
Yeah, thanks. So just a quick comment again, because I'm not advocating that every single file should necessarily have a PID. It depends on the relationship between the digital objects in a package. If they can't stand on their own and they can't be reused on their own, you know, and it's almost like separate files representing tables in a relational database, or it is a survey together with the results in a different file and so on, then you know it's not so clear that it's that there's an advantage to having them separate, or there's actually no advantage in some cases. But if it is clearly a different digital object, and I think one can make rules for that granularity, if the authors are different, so that the PID must attract metrics, citation index information for a different set of authors or creators, then for me, that's a compelling reason to have a separate metadata record and a completely different PID for it. Similarly, if it can be reused on its own, it's likely that it will be. And then you also want to have a unique identifier for it on its own.
Phil, go ahead, unless someone wants to directly respond to what Wynn said.
Well, I'm still on the thread of, I don't know when I'm working on licenses at the file level yet, but since you've got me thinking about it. Instead of like a custom license, like the workaround now with the new code that's coming in is a custom license that says all the data is license X and all the code is license Y. I was just thinking that we already have a mechanism that at the file level you can have a tag. So common tags are for data, documentation, or code. So maybe the license could be attached to the tag, and then as you tag your files as this or that, then they just get whatever license you want. Just a thought. Thanks.
Just directly following up on that, Phil, I guess I don't have a firm grasp of what metadata is attached to a tag. Would you be able to put any kind of machine readable metadata as in addition to or along with the tag for a file if you're going to include the license that way? Or would it just be kind of a simple, I'm indicating CC BY, and if you want to know what that means, go to creativecommons.org and look up CC BY? Yeah, tags are very simple now. There are actually two kinds of tags. Like I said, the data documentation code. You sort of get a few out of the box, and then you can add your own custom tags. And there's a different kind of tag that's tabular tag, where it'll show like geospatial or time series and things like that. But all these are fairly simple. They don't have any relationship to licenses. So we would need to write more code to establish more relationships between a tag and some license. Thanks. Slava, I hope you are going to tell us more about data tags and how that could be used for licensing.
Yes, exactly. So a few years ago, we did implementation of proof of concept, and I've just shared link in chat. So basically how it works, probably I can even share my screen, right? Or
you might need, if Danny's here, he might need to give you permission.
Okay, no problem. Anyway, just open this link, go to slide.
You should be able to now. I think I just got the notification.
Okay, great. So let me try. Can you see something?
Yep, we can.
Okay, so we created this service, and it's really implemented as external service that allows to reuse data text functionality, but we did completely different implementation in Python. So it's also reusable, so it could be connected to other data repositories. So in Europe, we're using B2Share and other repositories. And basically, the point here that you have data tags in menu, and after you can go through our dialogue and answer questions. So like this is also customized dialogue, so you can get any kind of questions here. So basically, you are responding to questions, and after, based on your response, it will produce some label, some tag, and in this case, it's red. And this is where you can actually assign license. So if someone indicated that file probably CC0, but based on answers of user, it's not CC0, so it should be different one. And after it goes to metadata of file itself. So here you can see blue, red, and green. And basically, we also can put license here on the file level. Yeah, so it was my short presentation.
That's great. That's a lot more. That's a lot more than how tags currently work. That's pretty exciting, and I think kind of a good idea for licensing. That would be a potential to investigate, I think. I did want to quickly show the results of our Mentimeter. Hang on. All right, so for the default license that different repositories are using, it does seem like CC0 is the majority in use as the default license, with a few CC BYs. I'm definitely interested in learning more about why CC BY as a default license makes the most sense, what context is along with that. Maybe I should have asked also what your repository is. Helpful to know too. But QDR says that theirs is a default custom license, which maybe it does make sense for qualitative data. Scholars Porter has CC0 as their default with custom templates for each CC license plus a custom license. So lots of customizing available there. All right, so just wanted to share those quickly.
Katie, do you want somebody who has CC BY as a default to answer your question?
I would, but only if people feel comfortable and want to participate. I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
So in Webflow Hub, we are a bit torn about what to do as a default license. We know we don't want CC0 because we really do want to have attribution, but CC BY is not good for software, and workflows are kind of like software. And then the open source licenses are also tricky because workflows use other things, so software use other software, and then you have this whole license compatibility thing coming up again. That means it was very hard to even pick a default, and so we didn't.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I would expect that's the standard thought from other places as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and scroll through the chat a little bit to see if there's any line of conversation that we haven't maybe exhausted yet. But in the meantime, if anybody has anything they want to bring up, please go ahead and unmute yourself and bring it up.
Yeah, if I may jump in, we have had this discussion about the license at file level and dataset level. And so if you have different licenses on different files, so what would then be, or would it make any sense to have a license on a dataset level? Or would it be then the most restrictive, would it reflecting the most restrictive license on file level, or?
Can I actually chime in with that, Philip? Because I mean, I do have a couple of collections that we have these general terms of use. It's not a formal license, but it's a license that was approved by the Office of General Counsel at Harvard for the Murray Archive collection, which is mostly qualitative data. But within that, I have subject data, and those subject data have different publication agreements. So there's one case where I have to put a general license that's approved by OGC, because that's in the memorandum of agreement that I've signed with the contributors. And then each subject, there may be 20 subjects in this case I'm thinking about, each one has a different publication restriction. And I end up putting that in the metadata, in the file description level, because it's easier for us to manage our collections on Dataverse that way, looking at a file and seeing the restriction right away when we're granting access. So I'm using it to manage my data as well as license the data, so that I don't have to keep going back to the memorandum of agreement every time I need to check a subject for restrictions and licensing on publication. I mean, that's a complicated one for me right there, but I do have a data set level permission or license, DUA, I should say, that I have to put into every data set, because that's what they're agreeing to when a user comes in initially. And then each subject has some kind of permission restriction, licensing use restriction. Complicated enough?
Whoops, I was muted.
Okay.
It looks like Julian has his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, so Sonia, it sounds like when people want to use the data, I mean, is it fair to say that you can use the data the way that is stated in the the terms of use at the data set level, except if the file says something, except if the terms at the file level say something different?
That's right. So I have those two terms. You're agreeing to terms at the data set level, and then there might be a restriction on some of those subjects in that data set where you cannot do something extra.
When you say subjects,
Mm-hmm.
you mean is the subject data generally like represented in each file?
Each file is a subject, yes. So we're talking about qualitative data, transcripts. Some you can publish on, some you cannot. So you have the general terms of use, and then any extra licensing information or use information is going directly into the description of the file.
Okay, so this sounds like it's more like the reverse of what you had said, Philip, right? Where the data set wouldn't be the most restrictive, wouldn't get the most restrictive terms from one of the, whichever file has the most restrictive, but it's like the other way around.
That's what it sounds, yep.
Tanya did point out a good question that came up in the chat that is, maybe a little bit related to this, maybe not, but Philip asked, what if I want to reuse a data set that was licensed with, CC BY, whatever, not CC0, but then actually the data sets only contain facts in them. Can you just disregard the license? And I will say that as I was, kind of doing some up to the moment research for my quick overview earlier, that it does, you cannot add a license to something that does not have copyright protection. So, right, that's why kind of the beginning is important. The beginning of the process, it's important to actually figure out or make a good guess on whether or not you have copyright protection over what you want to publish. if it does just contain facts and it is not copyrightable under, whatever jurisdiction you are in, then you can disregard whatever the license is because there is no copyright over it. There isn't like a lot of case law or examples of people kind of trying to test this. So that's like theoretically what I've found, but I think it's a good question. So if other people have thoughts on that kind of aspect of it, like how copyrightable in fact are data, and what do you do if a license gets put on something that isn't copyrightable? How should users proceed? How should repositories handle things like that too?
Yeah, I guess if all the files have their own license in a data set, it doesn't really matter what kind of license the data set itself has, because then everything is clear. But if not all files are licensed explicitly, then maybe the license on the data set level will have some impact, I guess. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is, rather confusing, and everyone is kind of just trying to make their best good faith effort, but it's not that useful when you want machines to be able to make decisions based on that also. There was another good question about what happens if a user makes a mistake. So what if someone puts a CC0 license on something that shouldn't be public domain? Technically, you can't take that back once it's been applied. So there were a few comments in the chat about, how do you deal with mistakes like that?
I guess one quick note on that is just that the technical aspect with the new proposal for multiple licenses is that there is an admin API to go change that after publication, which is basically the problem, right? Once you publish, the user can't change that license, but that API doesn't impact the fact that the thing was out there with a different license on it for a while. And what do you do about that?
Thanks, Jim. I will acknowledge that I missed the up to the moment chat conversation. Wim had a great point about how Sonia's use case highlighted the need for automated combination of licenses and what that means for the repository software. Wim, do you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Yes, thanks. Just to say that it's a great test for, let's say, expressing licenses as something that's machine actionable, but then also saying if they are applicable to in combination in a data set, what does that mean? Or if they combine because of remixing and creation of new output, what do they mean? So the Sonia's use case is one where it applies to a mixture of licenses for the same set of digital objects. But there's also then the other use case where there's a diversity of licenses in the input, and that must in one way or another determine what applies to the output.
Alicia or Sonia, if you guys want to expand a little bit more on what you've been talking about in the chat.
Oh, we're just talking about how, where to put information in the terms page. And I can't, we've thought about putting these individual licensing restrictions in the terms page, but then my terms page is going to be, character wise, I would probably surpass the limitations. And then people won't read it. That's the other thing. If you put it in there, everybody has to read the entire terms page for 100 subjects when they come in. That's just not doable. Plus, if we're advertising Dataverse as a place to manage your content and not having to go back to, say, a written agreement that you had somewhere, for 50 years, you're pulling the licensing information into Dataverse. You wanted to be very clear as a person who's looking at a file as to whether they have access to it right there and then when they're looking at it, not having to go find it in the terms page when it gets really long. I mean, I have I have almost every field in my terms page filled out with some kind of use information that users have to agree to. In the terms of access, I have a link to the Qualtrics application that they have to fill out and sign because that signature is required to access these data because they're human subjects data and they're restricted. Adding any more to that terms tab, people wouldn't notice it. So one of the things is making it noticeable, right? We've been talking about how to make licenses noticeable. Would not work in the terms page, at least not for qualitative data, the way that I do qualitative data when I'm trying to make the metadata really discoverable for each subject. I don't want to put everything into a compressed file and put it up there. And putting everything in a compressed file would mean that somebody needs to actually read or look at a README file, right? To find out what all the restrictions are in a compressed file somewhere. So yeah, that is literally my use case. I have copyrighted measures that also fall into this category, measures that were developed by contributors, and they have to be given proper attribute for the license, for the measures before they use it. So that's another case where I have to put the licensing information directly into the file level description, because there's no licensing field in there for me to fill out and somebody download neatly from Dataverse.
Yeah, it's a good summary of a lot of the complications inherent in this topic. I wanted to kind of ask, bring back the conversation about kind of data tags as a potential option for file level licensing, especially because those are more of a machine readable way to do that. And Wim, I know that you're not like very intimately familiar with Dataverse architecture, but do you have a sense on whether, how machine readability would be affected by having licenses at the file level that are machine readable? Would you then have to kind of not have a license at the data set level? Would it, I don't, if you have a sense of whether or not what that would kind of affect the utility of machine readability in this case?
No, I don't think that matters. There are other cases, for instance, in the Earth and Environmental Observation field, where they have the concept of a data collection with its own metadata and licensing, and then they have individual data sets inside that collection that have its own licenses. So I think the challenge is not actually that model of a sort of an overriding license and then specific licenses for components of that node, but the problem, I think, is how to figure out to make them actionable by machines. How do we process the fact that there are two of those? If you give them to a human, they'll read both and figure out for themselves what they should do. But we need to somehow provide that same capability if we want to automate things. So I think that's actually the bigger challenge, is to, yes, there are some technical issues now on the Dataverse side to make these licenses applicable at the file level, but that we will solve in 6 months or a year from now. So the question is, what then? If we want to automate on a scale where we free the hands of curators to process more data sets and to serve a larger community, they can't be tasked with manual processing of all this.
Thanks. That's encouraging, I think. If you do know of that example, if it's linkable, if you would mind putting that in the community notes or in the chat so it can be recorded, I'd be interested to look and see exactly how that fleshes out. Thank you. There's Philip, Sonia, and Sherry are talking about maybe a scenario in which.
Yeah, somebody was, we were talking, somebody had asked if you could put all that information for the subjects or, documents into the term sections. And I had already said that would make it too long. To me, it would actually decrease the chances that someone actually looks at the license and uses it correctly because they're looking at so many files or so much information. And if we want to make sure that someone is actually reading the license, I mean, the shorter you make it, the better. If you make it too long, I don't think they're going to spend enough time looking at it. Personally, that's been my experience.
Hi, well, this is Sherry. I thought I heard either saw in chat or heard someone say, for example, if you had your software and other tabular files all in a data set, if you had some terms that said this file, is software under, MIT license, the rest of the files are totally CC0. Just something simple like that is what I thought I had seen.
Oh yeah, if
someone-
they,
that
I
was
could
all.
see that, right? No, yeah, if they make one sentence, yeah.
Yeah, in the Apache project, we do that even for software when we embed some software inside another, but only when it's compatible. Like there might be a BSD license you embed inside an Apache license, and we just add it in the end of the license file saying, oh, this file over here is this other license. So it's in a sense easier when it's more permissive because it just opens up more things you could do with those particular files. And if you missed it, you haven't done anything wrong. But it's a bit harder when they're kind of conflicting licenses because then you can't really pick one license for the whole thing.
Correct, that's true.
All right, well, with about 5 minutes left, I'd like to invite anybody else to kind of bring up either a final summary comment or, if there's anything that you were dying to talk about quickly, we can all think about it maybe and then reply in the Google group or something like that. But other than that, thanks for just a wonderful conversation, everybody. Terrific discussion, I think. I really appreciate it.
This is Tim's little sister, Kate.
Don't tell Tim, but I think she's cuter.
Yeah, she's nicer. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say that. He's behind my computer now.
All right, then I guess we can go ahead and wrap up, guys. The slides are all linked from the community notes, so follow up in whatever way makes the most sense.